Chapter 10, Energy Balance, Weight Control, and Eating Disorders, Screencast 6. Now, one of the biggest issues when we're talking about weight loss, how to lose weight, how to maintain a healthy weight, is an underlying control of problem behaviors. This is a list of some really important things to think about as you go on that journey of weight loss. One is chain breaking. Lots of our behaviors occur together. And if you actually break the chain, you prevent yourself moving on to the next negative aspect of that. We'll take a look at that in the next slide. Stimulus control. One thing that you can do is alter the environment to minimize any potential stimuli for eating. I know for me, one of the issues is kind of hanging out, watching television. You just want to grab something. That's not a great environment. Cognitive restructuring. A lot of people have really negative views towards eating. So it really is important that you change the frame of mind with how you look at eating and eating behaviors. There also is something important to have a contingency management. You know that there are going to be situations where you're going to trigger overeating. Have a plan on how to handle that, and also how to get yourself out of those situations if you find yourself in an environment that you know is going to be negative with respect to your eating behaviors. One thing that works really well is self-monitoring, tracking the food that you eat, when you eat, why, how you feel, physical activities, overall body weight. This way you actually have a path that you can look at and also see what you have accomplished. And that's really important. Now, Table 10.6 talks about a lot of behavior modification principles. I'm not going to take the time to go through all of this, but I think you get the idea of the various things that you can do here. One thing that I really do put a big emphasis on is portion control. I think that is a really, really major problem in our society. And I've shared this with many of my students in the past. If I go out to eat, one of the things that I almost do automatically now is I visualize how much of that food I'm going to eat in that particular sitting. And the rest I know that I'm going to bring home with me. Now, you might not be so good at that in the very beginning. So a real good recommendation is at the beginning of your meal, ask for the takeout container first. Then take away what you think you're not going to eat or leave what you think will be plenty for that meal. We have a tendency, if it's on our plate, we're going to eat it. So making that plate smaller or less appealing, those are things that are going to be really helpful overall. And as I said, there's lots of different ways that you can change your behavior, and they're all listed in this particular table. So it really is worth taking the time to look at them overall. Now, here, this is known as breaking the chain. And what I'm going to do here is kind of walk through this chain of behaviors. And what I talked about before is how can you actually break something in this chain and prevent the negativity from happening. So let's first look at the first thing that's being addressed here. You just had a really fulfilling dinner. Afterwards, you sit down in your favorite chair or couch. Okay? Then you start flipping through the channels, watching TV, and you just get bored. And quite often when we get bored, you get up from your chair and a common destination is going to the kitchen. Once you're in the kitchen, you know what's going to happen next. You're going to open the refrigerator. You're going to putter around, look for things that you want. It could be cheesecake. It could be ice cream. It could be any of those things. But deep inside, you know that you really don't want to have that because it's not in your best interest. Then you start to feel guilty. And then all of a sudden you want more cheesecake, and it really is just a downward spiral. So looking at these behaviors that tend to lump themselves together is a really, really good strategy, and finding out what you can do to break this chain of events from actually happening. Now, when we look at weight loss maintenance, so now you've gotten to the point where you've lost the weight that you wanted to, now comes the real challenging part. Now, there are some behaviors that we know that are especially found in those that are successful in maintaining weight loss. One is eating a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. This is an issue because there is so much bad information about high carbs, and that's what people hear about. Okay? But what we do know is eating carbohydrates, that's what our body needs for energy. So if we're looking at a good plan keep in mind this is based on the higher end of the AMDR. 25% of your overall calories should be fat, and 56% of your diet should be carbohydrates. Now, look at the carbohydrates that are being ingested. They're fruits, they're vegetables, they're grains. They all fall under the category of complex carbs. And notice we're really not seeing a lot of simple carbohydrates there. That's where we start to see empty calories. So choosing things that are actually high in nutrients and low in calories is also really important. Now, having breakfast. I know many of us, and I'm especially guilty of this, of not eating breakfast, but there's plenty of evidence that indicates that individuals that eat breakfast, it actually causes the body to burn more fat. Now, there's also less tendency to overeat due to hunger because you actually have stimulated satiety. Self-monitoring. Keep track of your weight. Keep a food journal. Those are all really important things because they can actually chart your successes. You might also see what your slipping points are, but that also is beneficial. And then, of course, making sure that you stay physically active, and that should be about an hour per day. It doesn't have to be all in one chunk. It can actually be broken up across the day. And especially when you're first starting to add physical activity, that's a good way to do it. And notice we're using the term physical activity and not necessarily exercise. Exercise is a very formal event, whereas physical activity could be almost anything. Taking the dog for a walk, going for a long walk after dinner, any of those things. Just increasing the amount of movement that you're doing and trying to strive for an accumulated hour of increased physical activity each day. Now, one thing that we all are in tune to and have fallen for in the past are fad diets. Now, what we're going to do next are look at red flags that you should look for that indicate that the diet being advertised or talked about or whatever is not credible. So we're going to call these the red flags. 1, recommendations that promise a quick fix. Losing weight is not a quick fix. We know that the idea of a quick fix, that's very appealing, but all the evidence shows that weight loss is one of the hardest behaviors overall to work on. Dire warnings of danger from a single product or regimen. That's really making things very negative, but trying to entice you to that. Claims that sound too good to be true. We always want them to be true, but deep inside we know that they're not. Simplistic conclusions drawn from a complex study. The example that I like to make about simplistic conclusions are the fact that low carb diets are beneficial because high carb diets stimulate the release of insulin, and that is a storage hormone. That is one of the most oversimplified statements out there. Yes, insulin is a storage hormone, but at the same time, there's other things that we can do. We know that we need carbohydrates. They should make up the majority of our energy intake, and that's probably one of the real aspects of diets and advice that I hear that has a tendency to drive me crazy when they always focus on that a high carb diet is bad for you. Recommendations that are based on a single study. There's no way that a single study is going to be the answer to anything. If we look at what we know in science, findings have to be replicated. That's really important. One study is not going to show everything, and it really is important to keep that. We look for verification of findings. Then we know we're talking about something that truly is more legitimate. Dramatic statements refuted by reputable scientific organizations. That's especially important, okay, when we look at those. A list of good versus bad foods. I really do not like describing a food as bad or good. I really strive for moderation, and moderation really is one of the keys that we should work for when we're working on a diet. Recommendations made to help sell a product often use testimonials. Keep in mind that the individuals making these testimonials are quite often paid actors. They may not even have tried the product or know anything about it at all. Recommendations that are based on studies that have been published without peer review. In science, peer review is the gold standard. Basically, the work that you have published is reviewed by others in your field or discipline, and they determine whether or not this study is worth publishing. really, really important because there's a lot of bad information out there, and the internet in particular has made it so much easier to distribute bad information and misinformation. Recommendations from studies that ignore differences among individuals or groups. No one is the same. Whenever we're talking about individuals, we need to keep in mind that we really have to have a study group that is reputable of the population. And that's not often the case. Now, when we look at some diet plans that are out there, a few things to kind of take a look at. First, we'll talk about restricted carbohydrate diets. I've talked about these already. These are diets that lead to reduced glycogen synthesis and reduced amounts of water within the body. This results in relatively rapid weight loss, and we know whenever we have rapid weight loss, it's usually due to the loss of water weight. It forces the liver to produce glucose via gluconeogenesis, and when we use the process of gluconeogenesis, that means that source is coming from our body proteins. Carbohydrates are our energy source, not proteins. We want to save proteins for other important functions that they play within our body. Structure, enzymes, immunity, all of those things. Generally, the amount lost and improvements to health are no greater than moderate fat, higher carbohydrate, high protein diets, as only short-term results are seen. So that's another really important thing to keep in mind. When we look at diets that are restricting carbohydrates, you see rapid improvement, but at the same time, it's strictly for a short-term basis. A more negative consequence that's tied into a restricted carbohydrate diet is an increase in LDL levels. And we know that LDL is what we refer to quite often as the bad cholesterol because it is the lipoprotein that is responsible for transporting cholesterol throughout our body. It has the potential to be oxidized and at that point also to be involved in the formation of plaque. Low-fat diets contain approximately 5 to 10% energy intake as fat. They are not harmful, but they are very, very difficult to follow. Fat adds an awful lot of texture to our food. It's not necessarily just the calories, but lots of other things along the way. And many individuals get really bored on a diet that's that low in fat. Another thing that makes it difficult for many people to follow is it's mostly grains, fruits, and vegetables. And we already know that those are things that people really struggle to get even on their own, not even if we look at about a diet. It's going to make it even more difficult. Novelty diets. There have been many types of those over the ages, and what they tend to do is actually emphasize a single food or food group. Examples would be the carrot diet, grapefruit, rice, eggs alone. And that's really a big issue. Rationale for this is that you get bored with foods and reduced energy intake. Many individuals will abandon the diet, and also you may have to purchase a food or service or anything like that. Table 10-7, this is a summary of popular diet approaches to control weight. Now, one thing that should be recommended is seeking professional help. Doctors should be the first professional that you contact or for weight control advice. They are probably not going to give you the information you need themselves. But what they will be able to do is potentially recommend a registered dietitian or an exercise physiologist to help you. The registered dietitian, they understand the composition of food, the psychological importance of food, and how to create a diet that is more likely to be for someone to stick with, and so on. Whereas the exercise physiologist, they're going to be the individual that gives you specific advice about physical activity, exercise regimens, and so on. Ideally, you are working with both of these professionals. Drug treatment for weight loss. There are lots of new drugs out there. Some of the more original drugs were drugs that actually enhance norepinephrine and serotonin activity within the brain. This causes the neurotransmitters to remain active for a longer period of time, and it actually prolongs the sense of reduced hunger. Things that are amphetamine-like in nature, think about pseudoephedrine, which is no longer available. What they actually do is prolong epinephrine and norepinephrine activity, and they actually act as an appetite suppressant. There are some drugs that actually will inhibit lipase, that will reduce the digestion of fat. Numerous medications that have weight loss as a side effect. Antidepressants are a class, but now we also are familiar with all of the GLP-1 agonists, examples of Ozempic and so on, that we know are very often being prescribed now and used for weight loss. Keep in mind, these drugs originally were developed to treat type 2 diabetes, where weight loss is a really important way of controlling type 2 diabetes. Now, there are treatments of severe obesity, and they include very low-calorie diets. These are diets that only provide anywhere from 400 to 800 calories per daily. These have the great potential to be very, very dangerous, and they should only be taken when they are supervised by a physician. Monitoring is very important. It's very easy to get electrolyte imbalances and other significant problems associated with these very low-calorie diets. If we look at another option for those individuals that are severely obese, we're looking at gastroplasty. These are procedures that decrease stomach capacity to 30 mils or bypasses a short segment of the small intestine. You may have heard of the band. Here are some examples of various procedures that are involved in gastroplasty, and these all generally result in significant weight loss. Another factor to keep in mind about these surgical procedures is quite often one of the most critical impacts of these. If you are a type 2 diabetic that has this procedure done, type 2 diabetes actually goes into remission shortly after these procedures. These were procedures that were never paid for by insurance companies to begin with, but now, because of the impact they have on decreasing and minimizing type 2 diabetes, it's actually cheaper for an insurance company to pay for a one-time procedure as opposed to managing pharmaceutically a long-term chronic disease such as diabetes. Now, one thing that is probably even more difficult than losing weight is treatment of the underweight. We know that there are significant health risks associated with individuals that have a BMI below 18.5. Specifically, we're putting a focus here on women, women who have a very low body mass index, or more critically, a lower than normal or extremely low body fat percentage, experience significant issues. One would be the loss of menstruation, so this is going to have an impact on all reproductive function. The impact it has on promoting osteoporosis through the loss of bone mass, many complications associated with pregnancy and surgery. Because of the impact on immunity, there's going to be a slow recovery after illness. And especially if we're talking with young children or teens, it can very much interfere with normal growth patterns, in some situations resulting in death. One of the things to focus on here is the addition of healthy calories. The number to shoot for will be 500 kcals per day. And the thing to keep in mind here, this is probably one of the few times where energy-dense foods will be recommended. And those individuals that are actually trying to increase weight, to put on weight is very difficult to do in a healthy way. We all know how to do it in an unhealthy way, but it is very difficult to do so in a way that's healthy. Another thing that people need to consider if they are underweight is looking at the amount of physical activity that they are doing, and they may actually really need to reduce the physical activity that they're participating in, because they actually need to reduce their caloric expenditure overall, because the goal here is actually to gain weight.